Hello and welcome to our whole Counsel of God book club. I almost said podcast, but that's not right. Tonight we're going to be talking about the New Testament textual criticism. Last time we started discussing textual criticism. What is going on there? Oh. Sorry, I don't know what that was. My computer must have had the show on, so it was like on a delay. It was saying everything I was saying. Anyway, sorry about that. So last time we talked about textual criticism in the Old Testament. We talked about the Torah and really especially the Septuagint. And remember that Septuagint is kind of just colloquialism for the Old Testament in Greek. But we also talked about the Samaritan Torah and the Syriac and the Aramaic. And the point that we saw is that Old Testament textual criticism is less about comparing different manuscripts, and it's really more about trying to examine different ancient translations of the Old Testament versus the Masoretic reading of the Old Testament, so that we can see what ancient Judaism was teaching before the rabbinic Judaism came about and basically created their own text. And then the last thing we examined was the Dead Sea Scrolls, which has been really useful because it enables us to understand not only it enables us not only to compare the Old Testament manuscripts that we have to actually older manuscripts, but it's also enabled us to see areas where the Masoretic text is simply clearly wrong and where the Septuagint is actually vindicated. But tonight we're not going to be talking about the Old Testament anymore. Tonight we're going to be talking about the New Testament, which is just a very different type of textual criticism. And we're going to learn about different manuscript traditions and also what New Testament scholars are talking about when they talk about other sources outside of the text that we have. And the first thing that I'm just going to say off the bat is we believe that the apostles wrote the New Testament. So that's going to put us at odds with a lot of Protestant and even Catholic higher critical scholars. So a lot of what we're going to be doing tonight is going to be refuting the way textual criticism is usually done, because as we've talked about before, the goal of textual criticism within Orthodoxy is more about examining the breadth of tradition and being able to see the full weight of all of the manuscripts that we have so that we can appreciate the way God has given his word to all Orthodox Christians everywhere. Whereas the way that modern textual criticism tends to work is this effort to try to establish a quote-unquote original text, which is really just sort of a way to chop up the text that's given, or the text that we have. So let's start by taking a look at what Father Stephen says on page 65 under New Testament textual criticism. He says, New Testament textual criticism is functionally a very different discipline from Old Testament textual criticism. A massive number of manuscripts in the original language, Greek, going back to the middle part of the 2nd century AD, attest to the New Testament texts. In many cases, the earliest known manuscripts of the New Testament texts date to within 50 to 100 years of their composition, meaning the composition of the original. This is a stark contrast with the Old Testament, where often the earliest known manuscripts date to centuries or even millennium after their original composition and are in a language different from the one in which they were originally composed. Further, the Greek manuscripts of the New Testament come from a wide variety of locations and traditions scattered all over the former Roman world. Our earliest Old Testament manuscripts all come from one location, namely Qumran, and represent, in most cases, multiple copies of the same text. So, our New Testament manuscripts date to within 50 to 100 years, he says, of the actual composition of the New Testament. If you compare that to any other ancient document, that's actually quite astounding. It means that the New Testament is the most well-attested ancient text that we have. In a little bit, I'm going to compare that to some other ancient texts that we have so that you can get a good idea of what that means. But again, to review, textual criticism tends to attempts to try to create an original text, and we've pointed out that that's really essentially a vain effort. You're not ever going to be able to recreate a hypothetical original, and as we saw in even week 1, recreating an original doesn't really make any sense, because what original is the original that you're trying to recreate? What Paul said to a scribe, what the scribe initially wrote, what happened after Paul edited the scribe's writing. So what Father Stephen says is this has led the discipline to refocus on describing the various shapes and traditions of the New Testament text as a historical matter and abandon the quixotic quest for the original. So this is why in Orthodoxy we're trying to make the most out of the tradition. So getting back to what Father Stephen says here on page 66, he says, the extant manuscripts of the New Testament text come in several types and present a variety of features that largely depend on their date of composition. Additionally, variation in format exists based on the region of their provenance. That the copying of these manuscripts took place across such a diverse range of places and times is positive evidence for the preservation of the New Testament text. There was never a time in the history of the Church, despite certain conspiracy theories, in which one central authority had control over the Greek text of the New Testament. This means that at no point in time could the text have been systematically altered or corrupted at the behest of some individual or group. An alteration of the text in one place at one time could be countered by copies of the text from earlier times and other places. This was precisely the method taken by the Church Fathers in correcting the errors of heretics like Marcion, who argued that their versions of the New Testament texts were correct. Well, over 2 millennia, thousands of small variations between manuscripts have appeared. The sheer number of diverse manuscript traditions allows these variations to be identified as such and easily dealt with. Whether a variant is as simple as a spelling error or omitted word on the one hand, or a deliberate change of the text on the other, manuscripts of the New Testament are available to make the correction. In no place in the New Testament are significant elements of the text abrogated or lost. So the most important thing there is that there was never a time when the Church didn't have her scriptures. The scriptures have also never been corrupted. So oftentimes scholars like Bart Ehrman will talk about this kind of cynical approach where they'll talk about there being more textual variants than actual words in the New Testament. In other words, there's an average of 3 variants per word for the New Testament. And the implication is that we can't really trust what the New Testament says. But this is an absurd way of approaching textual criticism because, as Father Stephen points out, the vast majority of those are just spelling errors. So if you remove spelling and grammar errors, there really aren't that many variants at all, and there's no variants in the entire New Testament that change the theology of a text or would in any way challenge the theology of the church. So there's really no reason why textual criticism should, or why textual variants should pose an issue to the faithful Christian. Now, going back to just the New Testament manuscripts themselves, there are over 5,800 New Testament manuscripts, which is more than exist for any other ancient text. And again, we'll see that that's more by a long shot. Most of these are fragmentary in nature. So the oldest is about the size of a credit card and is a fragment of the Gospel of John. That's from AD 125. So just about 30 years after the Gospel of John was originally written. And what's interesting about that fragment is there's actually a story about how it was discovered, that there was a lot of scholars who believed at the time that St. John's Gospel was actually written in the late 2nd century and therefore couldn't have been written by St. John. And there was this whole theory behind that. And then when they discovered this fragment of the Gospel of John and they dated it, it was dated to AD 125, which proved that obviously the Gospel of John was much older than than these scholars had believed. And the part that's amusing about that is that if you look at this fragment, in the very middle of the fragment, the most readable section of it says, "What is truth?" So it's just kind of an amusing way that God rebuked the unbelief of these scholars. But the other Gospels obviously have larger gaps between their composition and their first manuscript. The simple reason being that the other Gospels were written before the Gospel of John. But even the longest of these is only about 100 years. So the average is about 75 years. But even the largest gap that we have between a manuscript and the original is only 100 years. So if we compare that to other ancient texts, for example, Father Stephen says, Father Stephen says, this vast number of manuscript sources is particularly striking when compared to other Greek and Latin literature from the ancient world. For example, we know of Aristotle's commentary, The Constitution of Athens, from only 4 Greek manuscripts, and none of these manuscripts is complete. Even when all 4 are collated, gaps are still present in the text. We know of Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, written in the 5th century BC from only 8 manuscripts, the earliest of which is from AD 900. This represents a gap of more than 1,500 years. Julius Caesar's account of the Gallic Wars is known from only 10 manuscripts, the earliest of which dates to the 9th century AD, representing a gap of 900 years. Tacitus's Annals and the Histories is an important historical work regarding the Roman Empire that includes some of the earliest information about the origins of Christianity. It was written around AD 100 in 30 books, only 14 of which, plus portions of another 3, still exist. The surviving books are known in only 2 extant manuscripts that date to the 9th century and the 11th century, respectively. So, essentially, if Bart Ehrman and these other textual critics who say that we can't trust the New Testament, if they were consistent, they would have to say that we really can't know anything about history until you get to the point where the printing press was invented, because you simply don't have any document outside of the New Testament that's nearly as well attested as the New Testament itself. It's the most well-preserved and well-attested collection of writings from the ancient world, even compared to other religious texts, for that matter. For example, I was listening to a lecture and they were talking about a Buddhist priest who they had been interacting with. And this Buddhist priest made the point that Buddhists don't have anything similar to the New Testament. They don't have any um, any authoritative set of writings or teachings directly from Buddha or Siddhartha Gautama. They only have, not in the way that we have the gospel, they have some traditions that they assume go back, but they don't have any authoritative where they know for sure that Siddhartha Gautama said this statement. The Hindu Vedas are actually heavily disputed even within Hinduism, which is why Buddhism and Jainism exist. Buddhism and Jainism are actually heresies of Hinduism. And the reason why they exist is because basically Buddhists represent Hindus who rejected the Hindu scriptures in a lot of ways. So the Quran actually is, there's multiple variants of the Quran, and even though you'll often hear those practicing what's called dawah, which is Islamic apologetics, you'll often hear them say that the Quran has been perfectly preserved and that there are no textual variants and that there are no variations at all. But then what's interesting is when you compare that to those same Islamic apologists when they are teaching other Muslims, you'll see them say the complete opposite. When they're teaching other Muslims, they say, well, actually, in the North African Quran is totally different from the Middle Eastern Quran. There's totally different variants. There's totally different ways that it's recited. These are very different things. And then when they're speaking to Christians, oh, no, the Quran is perfectly preserved. There's no difference because, frankly, because in Islam, you're allowed to lie to unbelievers. So that's why they do that. But getting back to variations within the text. So in Islam, they're saying that there's no textual variants. We're admitting that there are textual variations. And so what do textual variations mean? I said earlier what they don't mean, but what do they mean? Well, Father Stephen says, with literally thousands of handwritten copies, obviously any given New Testament manuscript will contain variations and even outright errors. There are many suggestions as to why this is so. Most likely it is because for most of history and in most of the world, Christianity was not a primarily text-based religion. The focus of Christianity was on the liturgical celebration of the Eucharist and the moral life. This is not to say the text of Scripture was irrelevant, but rather that the public reading and preaching of the Scripture served these other two ends. The Scriptures were preached to build up believers in lives of virtue and prayer, and the reading of Scripture was a central liturgical and ritual act in the Eucharistic gathering. In contrast, following the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in AD 70, Rabbinic Judaism lost the vast majority of its ritual life, with the text of the Hebrew Bible as its only artifact of what Judaism had been. So the fact that Christianity is not a text-based religion is actually kind of an easily overlooked statement, but it's extremely important to understanding Christianity itself. And I have a whole video about that called The Bible is Not the Christian Quran, where I go through an article that explains what it means that Christianity is not a text-based religion. There's an article by Father Stephen Freeman as well called Has Your Bible Become a Quran? Both of those I would recommend both of those on this topic. But essentially, the implication of the fact that Christianity is not a text-based religion is that Christian scribes did not have the same imperative to preserve the text letter for letter and word for word, because the point of preserving the text was so that it could be used in the liturgy and in the life of the church, not so that scholars could debate about the article in some text. So this is also why notes and glosses were not considered problematic, which is why it's kind of funny when you hear, like in James White lectures, sometimes he'll say, in John chapter, I think it's John chapter 4, where it talks about the angel of the waters, and he says, this shouldn't be in the Bible. It's only in the Bible because it was part of someone's sermon notes or some absurd thing. This is his claim. He thinks that somebody had their scroll and they were taking sermon notes there at church one day, and then their sermon notes ended up getting copied by scribes later who thought this was part of the Bible. But the thing is that these notes and glosses aren't an issue if you believe that the point of preserving the text is the liturgical life of the church. This is also why most of our ancient manuscripts are in the form of lectionaries for church, not in the form of like a complete Bible. Most ancient people did not have, a leather-bound Bible sitting around their house. That just wasn't realistic for the vast majority of people. But lectionaries are something that most churches did possess.
That would have been like owning a Lamborghini.
Right, exactly. It would have been...
They didn't make them.
Yeah.
Right, they didn't...
Yeah. Even at the point when they did, they were so expensive.
Right, exactly. Like,
it was all handwritten on
exactly.
papyrus or
on papayas. It was all handwritten on papayas. That's why we don't have very many manuscripts of ancient books. And mangoes are sweet. But I think I pointed this out last week as well, that Father Stephen in this book kind of ignores this factor, but I think persecution is also a huge factor as to why textual variants enter into the text, because when you read ancient stories of Jews preserving the text of the Old Testament, you'll read stories of Jewish scribes. Like there's one famous story of a Jewish scribe who would write a single letter and then go take a bath, a cold bath, and then come back and write a single letter and then go. Well, Christians didn't have time to do all that because Romans are confiscating our books and burning them. Romans are burning us in the Colosseum. Jews are stoning us like St. Stephen. Romans are crucifying us in the Colosseum, feeding us to lions. If you know that your life is going to be cut short, or is very likely to be cut short by persecution, you are not sitting there and you also have the desire to preserve this text. You're not sitting there thinking, I'm going to go take a bath in between letters that I write. No, you're going to write the text as best as you can, as fast as you can, and then get that out to the people. So the fact that Christians were being so to this very day, Christianity is, even according to the UN, Christianity is the most persecuted religion in the world. Mm-hmm. And that's to this very day. In the ancient world, in a lot of ways, it was worse in the Roman Empire. So you can look that up for yourself. You can look up the statistics yourself, but Christianity is the most persecuted religion. And I think that this reveals two things. First of all, this makes it even more impressive that the Christian scriptures are the most preserved ancient document, because that means that a document that was actively being desecrated and destroyed all over the world is the document that is simultaneously the most well preserved from ancient history. But also, it does indicate that we didn't have time to be playing these games that Jewish scribes were able to be playing. So when people make this argument like, oh, Christian scriptures aren't as exactly preserved as the Jewish Old Testament, well, first off, we've already seen that that's an overstated claim, because the Old Testament is not as well preserved as it's often presented as being. But it's also a claim that makes no sense, because it doesn't take into account the fact that Christianity is simply a persecuted religion, or at least has been historically. And so that's why. Again, I brought up the thing about there being quote unquote more variations than words. And in a brief response to that, I'll quote from R.C. Sproul. He said, and R.C. Sproul is a Protestant scholar, but he said, I could write a complete New Testament commentary, an apologetics commentary supporting every verse, and I could do that without ever quoting a single conservative scholar, because the fact is that for every one verse that an individual liberal scholar denies, you can find 5 liberal scholars affirming that verse and denying some other verse. So I could write an entire positive commentary of the New Testament without ever quoting a conservative scholar. And R.C. Sproul is correct about that, but more importantly, even these scholars admit that, as Father Stephen pointed out, there's really only a handful of these variants that even make any difference, since the vast majority are just spelling and grammatical errors. And even that handful of so-called important variants they don't have any effect on Christian teaching or doctrine. Just because a text says that, I don't know, I can't think of one off the top of my head, but the point is they don't affect Christian doctrine. If you know of a variant that you think does affect Christian doctrine, feel free to include it in the comments or whatever, but I don't know of any that actually would affect Christian doctrine. And even if they did, I mean, that's the beauty of having the church. Like, I don't need some text to prove my faith, but the fact is that they simply don't. So now, the next thing that we want to learn about, or the last thing we want to learn about, is families of manuscripts. So thinking about families of manuscripts, Father Stephen says, though the practice has recently fallen out of favor, it was once traditional in the field of textual criticism to speak about families of New Testament manuscripts. As manuscripts were discovered, studied, and cataloged, patterns started to emerge. Certain variations in the text would appear in more than one manuscript. The best explanation for these matches was that these manuscripts were somehow related. For example, one might be a copy of the other, or they might both have been copied from the same original manuscript. This includes both regular variations and mistakes. As these patterns began to emerge between manuscripts, scholars noted that very broadly, many of these correlations also corresponded to the rough geographic area and time period from which these manuscripts came. In order to speak about these manuscripts as groups, as collections of texts with similar characteristics, they were labeled as being text types or text families. So thinking in these terms is especially helpful for us as Orthodox Christians, because since we have a different goal in our textual criticism, these text families become very helpful because they enable us to kind of pinpoint the area of tradition that we're examining. And so like, for example, the Syriac tradition has certain variations that make it a little bit different. And this is actually beneficial to us in being able to examine the full breadth of Christian tradition. So the first family that we'll examine, and the oldest family, is what's called the Alexandrian text type. This is found in, not surprisingly, Egypt and North Africa, and is from about the 2nd to the 4th century. The reason why it stops there is because there are some social and political factors as well as religious factors that converge around that time. So, for example, you start to see the schism over the fifth ecumenical council. You start to see that schism happening and challenging so that what happens basically is that the Egyptian church starts focusing more on the Coptic tradition and stops producing as many of the Greek manuscripts. So that's why in the 4th century that happens. And then with the Islamic invasion, many of these factors become solidified because producing Greek New Testaments becomes seen by the Islamic overlords in Egypt as basically a way of introducing Byzantine rivalry into Egypt and trying to unite Christians against Islam, which we should be united against Islam. But nevertheless, for political reasons, that's not seen as good when the government is Islamic. So that even further hampers the ability of the Coptic Church to produce non-Coptic manuscripts. So we see the Alexandrian manuscripts basically stop there. That said, Father Stephen says, these manuscripts, however, were Orthodox Bibles at the time of their production. They provide an important window into the biblical text during a foundational period in the church's history in an extremely vital portion of the church in Alexandria. Largely because of these manuscripts' age and therefore relative uniformity, Westcott and Hort, the two most important textual critics in the formation of the modern Greek New Testament, labeled the Alexandrian text as the neutral text. In most modern Greek New Testaments, it constitutes the main body of the text, with variations and other text types reflected in the notes. So in other words, these texts are important both for their age and uniformity and how well preserved they are, because Egypt is just a really good place to store paper. The climate there is very conducive to preserving that kind of material for a long time. That said, the most important member of this family is what's called the Codex SINAITICUS. And the Codex SINAITICUS is... You need... Oh, no, the door's unlocked. You're good. The Codex SINAITICUS has about half of the Old Testament and all of the New Testament. Interestingly, it includes the complete canon. And so it's fascinating to me when Protestant scholars use the Codex SINAITICUS and Alexandrian family and base as like their authoritative text, but then it's an Orthodox Bible. That's when I say it includes the complete canon, what I mean is that the half of the Old Testament includes all of the books that are in the Orthodox Old Testament that aren't in the Protestant Bible. So even though it's missing the first books of the Bible that we all agree on, it includes all of the books that are disputed by Protestants. Anyway, this text was discovered, if you will, from a Western perspective, by Constantine von Tischendorf in the 1840s at St. Catherine's Monastery. And so basically, up until that point, it had been largely unknown by the Western world and was really only known by the Coptic Church. And then, interestingly enough, Tsar Alexander II actually funded Constantine von Tischendorf to go back and purchase the Codex Sinaiticus from the Copts and bring it back and study it and translate it. So he was basically funded by Tsar Alexander II to do all this scholarly work. And this is exactly why monarchy should never have been abolished. I mean, come on. You just can't beat that. That said, the other famous member of this text type is Codex Alexandrinus, which is spent most of its life in Alexandria, hence the name, but was brought to Constantinople actually by Cyril Lucaris, who is a figure that anybody who converted from Calvinism to Orthodoxy will know. Cyril Lucaris was a brilliant scholar, but he was very influenced by some Protestant ideas. That said, the Codex Alexandrinus ended up being sold to the British monarchy and is still housed at the British Museum with all their, stolen artifacts and stuff. They have the Codex Alexandrinus. And I actually have a picture of it here. So the URL for this video is actually a picture of the Codex Alexandrinus. So now the Western text type is the next one that we'll examine, and it's a little bit different. So this is from between the 3rd and 9th centuries. And what makes this one the most interesting is that it has a longer version of Luke and Acts than most of the other manuscripts have. It's thought that this is because Luke may have written sort of like a second edition that was more fleshed out. We don't really know why it's longer, but it's longer. And so many of the editions, interestingly enough, are actually considered older than the versions we have that are shorter. Many of the editions we have that are longer actually are considered to be older. The most famous example of the Western text type is Codex Bezier. Codex Bezier is from around 400 AD, but it's named after Theodore Beza, who was one of John Calvin's buddies, and Theodore Beza purchased it in 1562 or took possession of it in 1562. I don't know if that was purchased or if it was something much less consensual happening. But we'll just say he took possession of it, It was his now, And what makes the Codex Bezier important is that it's Latin on one side and Greek on the other side. So that makes it really useful for sort of scholarly examination. And that one is housed in Cambridge University. After that, we have the Byzantine manuscripts, which begin in the 5th century and represent the text copied for Orthodox Christians to use liturgically in the Byzantine Empire. So throughout the Byzantine Empire, the Byzantine manuscripts were what was used. And Father Stephen says here, in recent years, the usefulness of these text type categories has been called into question. It is generally very difficult to make generalizations that function as hard and fast rules about New Testament manuscripts. The names of these families can also be misleading. For example, many of the Western manuscripts were discovered in Syria. Codex Washingtonianus was copied in Egypt. One of the correctors of the Codex Alexandrianus was attempting to correct it to the Byzantine text type. Generalizations may usually be true, but in specific cases, they often prove false. As researchers implement modern computer tools for scanning and collating manuscripts, we are discovering just how complex the relationships truly are between our thousands of manuscripts. The people and the texts they carried with them were far more mobile in the ancient world than is often appreciated. Many texts which appear to be hybrids or unclassifiable according to the text type system are now having their origins classified through the reconstruction of their historical influences. Nevertheless, the terminology is still commonly used and should be understood. So then, as promised, there's also the other sources category. So, for example, ancient translations are useful, similar to the reasons why we discussed the Septuagint being useful in studying the Old Testament, or the Samaritan Pentateuch being useful. In the same way, it's often useful to examine Coptic, Syriac, or Armenian texts from before the schism. There's also Georgian translations that are extremely useful because of how old they are. Slavonic is actually an extremely important, the study of Old Slavonic is extremely important for this, because you can see sometimes some of the most ancient manuscripts we have are actually in Slavonic. And as far as the Old Testament goes, and studying Second Temple Judaism, there's actually tons of Second Temple Jewish literature that has only been preserved in Old Slavonic. I forgot to mention that last week when we talked about the Old Testament textual criticism, but there's actually tons of books that you can only read in Old Slavonic. They haven't been preserved in Aramaic or Hebrew. And some of those are now being translated into English. And it's really fun when you read, fun for somebody like me, when you read translations of a lot of the Second Temple Jewish literature, because very often it will say extant only in Old Slavonic, or existent only in one Greek manuscript and 27,000 Church Slavonic manuscripts. So many of these translations, though, the importance of this is that many translations in Slavonic or Georgian or Syriac or Coptic are actually older than some of our oldest manuscripts in Greek. So they present something very important. But our most important other source is actually the writings of the Holy Fathers, because the Holy Fathers are also preservers of tradition. And Bruce Metzger, a Protestant scholar, interestingly enough, said, and I quote, "We could reconstruct the entire New Testament. Even if all the copies of the New Testament were destroyed tomorrow, we could reconstruct the entire New Testament only from the quotes of the Fathers." So you could reconstruct every single verse of the Old Testament from how it's quoted, from the fact that it's quoted in the Church Fathers. Now, that said, there are some limitations to when we use the Church Fathers for reconstructing texts. For example, we have to remember that the Church Fathers are often using these texts in homilies or in books and letters that are written for a particular purpose. So with that in mind, some of their quotes may be paraphrases to drive home a point. So for instance, if the text said, Abraham believed God and he was justified, Saint John Chrysostom might say Abraham believed God, and if you believe God, you too shall be justified. Or if you believe God, you shall be justified. So he's altering the text slightly, but I think you can get the point that we can see the text that he's quoting. And obviously, this does not mean that we can't call church fathers quotes a manuscript tradition. I should say this. It does mean we can't call church fathers quotes a manuscript tradition, because quotes from the church fathers aren't a separate tradition. But the quotes from the church fathers are quite possibly the most important way in which the Old and New Testaments have been preserved for us, because through the church fathers, we've not only had the text itself preserved for us, but we also have the apostolic interpretation preserved down to our own day. So not only do we have what the apostles wrote preserved for us, but we also have the way that the apostles intended it preserved for us, because it's their own disciples explaining the text. Father Stephen says, all of these sources allow access to the depth and riches of the biblical tradition, as these manuscripts represent just that, tradition. The preservation of the text of the scriptures is the work of the Holy Spirit in the church. To attempt to identify some part of this tradition as correct or right or pure, as opposed to the rest, may be attractive in its simplicity, but it cuts such a person off from what the Holy Spirit has done in the church. For Orthodox Christians, all these manuscripts represent a part of our shared scriptural heritage, and their study increases our appreciation of that heritage. So this is why, at the end of the day, for Orthodox Christians, textual criticism is not about examining and choosing one text to the exclusion of others, but is rather about trying to get the most out of the full breadth of Holy Tradition. So thank you for watching, and please share this with your friends so that they too can be freed indeed.